Good evening and welcome to Gibson's Bookstore Remote. I am Elizabeth from Gibson's Bookstore, and I am joined this evening by author Ari Rabin Havt, who is joining us tonight to present his new book, The Fighting Soul, On the Road with Bernie Sanders. Ari Rabin Havt served as deputy campaign manager on Senator Bernie Sanders' 2020 presidential campaign and was a Sanders aide from 2017 to 2021. Ari, hello, welcome.
Hi, how are you doing? Thank you for hosting me. Thank you to Gibson's for having me and for remaining an independent bookstore and not forcing people to buy through unnamed websites.
The evil river is what we like to call them. Yes. So I appreciate your support of independent bookstores coming on tour for us. So your book, The Fighting Soul, is about your time with Senator Bernie Sanders. Tell me a little bit about this book. Tell me about the man behind the meme.
Yes, the man behind the meme. That's kind of the point, and that's why I wanted to write this book. He is one of the most famous people in the world, and he would hate that I describe him that way. He is one of the most influential people in the world. He is one of the most known people in the world. There are a few people in the world who, on the campaign, we had a pin that was for senior staff that enabled security to kind of see you through a line with just a pin, and for advanced staff and senior staff. And it was an outline of the pin was just an outline of his head and glasses, not even a picture of him. It was like a silver, it was like an aluminum reflective outline of his head and glasses. And just that outline is so iconic that around the world, everybody knows who he is. You just have to show that outline and people know that's Bernie. And there are very few people in the world who have that kind of brand identity, who have that kind of visibility. At the same time, he is someone that very few people know, that very few people have a personal, identifiable relationship with in the way you do with other politicians who are all about kind of the color, the backstory. You think about other politicians in the race and how many times you heard their backstory. You take John Edwards from 2004, I'm the son of a mill worker, and that's pretty standard in our politics. Bernie kind of just completely rejects the notion of being that type of politics. He rejects the notion that who he is matters at all. And while I respect that objection, I also feel for history, it was very important to write a book that told the story of who he was, and very important to write a book that used my frankly privileged position of having traveled with him for nearly 4 years to really tell people who this extraordinary person is. I do think the book really, I try to spice it with anecdotes, with real personal stories, with things that show this is a guy with a sense of humor. This is a guy who's funny that you often don't see in public. And I try to take everyone behind the scenes on the campaign to moments that you didn't see. And the point of the book wasn't, in fact, in the proposal, I was like, this isn't going to be a palace intrigue book. First off, that's real boring if you don't own the palace. It's not going to be kind of a staffer tell-all. That's not what was interesting. There's been a bunch of news stories that have come out of the book, but I kind of didn't expect it because I didn't write it with that intent where, I feel like at some points I annoyed the publisher with my kind of reticence with that, because I wanted to write a book that really captured the complete picture and wasn't distracted by like this newsy tidbit and that newsy tidbit. Bernie Sanders, who he is as a person beyond what we know of one of the most principled politicians ever in this country, is somebody whose influence, will in decades to come will rival that of other politicians who have, there are only a few examples of politicians who have lost a presidential race, but whose influence extends well beyond that race. The prime examples are William Jennings Bryan, 1912 Theodore Roosevelt, and then of course Barry Goldwater on the right in 1964, who without Barry Goldwater, you don't get Ronald Reagan. Bernie is kind of the next iteration of that. You think about how far the Democratic Party has swung over the last 4 years towards where Bernie is, towards the issues he cares about, towards things like, $15 minimum wage was a radical position in 2015. Now, the overwhelming majority of Democratic elected officials support it. And unfortunately, several don't, which has led to some not great legislative outcomes. But it went from basically Bernie and a handful of others to passing the House overwhelmingly, and the vast majority of Democrats in the Senate supporting it. But I also wanted to explain who he was. And the story to me, it begins with the heart attack, which I think is a seminal moment. But to me, there's two real bookend moments in the book. And the first happens at the second debate, which kind of marked the beginning of the real electoral season. It was in Detroit, it was in July. And we were sitting up in the green room, and it was just me, Bernie, and Faz Shakir alone in the green room. And these are the moments I wanted to bring people into. And Bernie is looking quite sullen. He looks very tired at that moment. He looked like he just wasn't in the place to debate. And Jeff Weaver texts Faz and I, Faz, the campaign manager, Jeff Weaver, one of his advisors going back decades, read him John Delaney's press release, right? Which John Delaney, you might not remember him as a candidate. He sent out a press release basically being like, I'm going to call Bernie a communist on stage. He's terrible for the Democratic Party. He's a terrible candidate. We can't do his thing. It was just an attack on Bernie. Faz and I kind of looked at each other when Faz read him the press release. And Bernie turns and goes, guys, do you know the Charlie Brown song? And he was referring to the Coasters song from the 50s with that refrain, why is everybody always picking on me? He said it. Faz picked up his phone and started playing the song. And Bernie got up and started dancing around the room and like shadow boxing, and just taking him back to that Motown era brought him into a place where he went out on stage and I think probably had what was his best debate performance. That was the debate with, I wrote the damn bill. That was where him and kind of Elizabeth Warren sat there just bucking off all these attacks from conservatives. It was a really seminal debate performance for him. And it was the moment of like, you don't see Bernie as someone who, listens to Motown and gets revved up that way. Bookend that to the last day of campaigning kind of before COVID, March 10th, we're back in Michigan and in Detroit, and we are supposed to go to Ohio that night for a rally in Cleveland. We don't know whether that rally's happening. COVID is spreading. States are closing down public events. There are real questions about, is the country shutting down? What's going on? Nobody really knows. We had a policy on the campaign dating back a few weeks where we were checking in with local health departments and officials and said we'd file their guidance. And we were kind of waiting to hear what Ohio was going to do. Both us and Joe Biden had rallies in Ohio that night. And while we were waiting, Bernie was like, let's go to some museums. We went to the Henry Ford Museum, which is a spectacular museum of Americana there. You have George Washington's tent from the Revolutionary War, JFK's limo. There's just a whole bunch of like very seminal pieces of Americana. And then Bernie's like, let's go to the Motown Museum, which is the original office of Motown Records in Detroit. We drive there, and this is not, the Motown Museum isn't what you think of as a museum. It's like a house in Detroit. And you walk in and Bernie's going through and he's so excited and he's looking at the records on the wall and he's talking about the history. He's remembering all the songs of his youth. And in what was really like the final moment on the campaign, the tour of the Motown Museum, if you've ever been there, ends in the Motown recording studio, the original one where so many hits were recorded, including My Girl. And he is standing in the studio singing My Girl, duetting with the tour guide. And there's a picture in the book. It's actually this. I was really proud to be able to include a bunch of my campaign photographs in the book, including the cover. But the first picture in the photo pullout section of the book is that picture from the recording studio. And it was the one time on the campaign where Bernie said, Ari, can you take my picture? That moment meant a lot to him, to have him inside this recording studio where so much of his childhood and his memories came from. And you see a big smile on his face in this studio. And then ultimately, like we walked out, and that's when we got text messages that the governor of Ohio was going to announce that all events in the state, all crowd events in the state were going to cease. The governor, Mike DeWine, specifically exempted political events, but we obviously weren't going to go ahead with our rally if they were canceling all events in the state. Like that would be massively inappropriate. And we flew back to Burlington, and that was the end of public campaigning at that moment. That was it. And I don't think I wanted to bring people into those moments where you see Bernie like you've never seen him, like you don't see him. I wanted to bring people other scenes in the book that I think are really important that have not been talked about this week. I was with Bernie, myself, AOC, and one of AOC's aides, Corbin Trent, drove across Kansas together in the summer of 2018. And nobody else was in the car with us. And it was that morning, they had met at breakfast at our hotel in Wichita for the first time. And they did a rally together. And then we took this ride where we had two cars, one for AOC, one for Bernie. And Bernie and AOC said, Bernie said, hey, why don't we drive together so we can talk? And they got in the car together, and I drove, and Corbin was in there. And the two of them talked about, she was asking him, what should she do in Congress? He was asking her questions, and seeing the two of them. And that is described in the book. And I hope people can appreciate that scene, because I think it was it was a moment that showed the bond between the two of them that's so strong, and kind of leading to that endorsement in Queensbridge Park. And one of the things I talk about in the heart attack chapter, in the heart attack episode, though, when I kind of get to that chronologically in the book in a later chapter, was we're in the hospital in Desert Springs, Nevada, Desert Springs Hospital in Las Vegas. And we're sitting there, and it's Thursday. It's kind of 2 days after the heart attack. And our phones Bernie shut off his phone because he was getting a bunch of complimentary phone calls. And he was he would just wanted to be with Jane and us and talk about the campaign. And he was like, I don't want these phone calls. And then Jane, Faz and my phone start ringing. And I got a call from Corbin, Faz, and he was like, can you pick up your damn phone? And he didn't use the word damn. I'm softening it for, public broadcast. And can Bernie pick up his blank phone? And at that moment, AOC called Faz's phone and asked to speak to Bernie. Corbin's like, get that to happen. Bernie picked up the phone, and she said she was endorsing, which kind of was the point of turnaround on the campaign. I wanted to bring people in to those moments that really they have no chance to see. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions or respond to anything, etc.
Okay, so to our audience members, if you have particular questions you'd like us to ask, we are happy to ask those tonight. I'll start us off a little bit here. Let's see, what's a good one?
I lost your volume.
I will backtrack. All right. So to our audience members, if you have particular questions you would like to ask, we are happy to ask them now. Please pop them into the chat sidebar or the Q&A box. And I will start off with a couple of my own while our audiences gets their typing fingers ready. So Bernie has always struck me as the kind of man who doesn't actually technically want to be president, but someone's got to do it, and he's got stuff to do. So it's not that he's seeking the grandeur of the office, but he's got political tasks to accomplish, people to help, and being a president would allow him to do it. Or the saying, a man who wants power shouldn't have it, whereas a man who doesn't want power for power is probably the person who would ought to have it. Why did Bernie get into and stay in politics? He's been very politically involved for decades and decades and decades. But he doesn't play into the glitzy part of politics. He isn't, there were memes online how he had like apparently one winter coat, one or two winter coats. He doesn't wear like the designer stuff. He doesn't have like the fancy watch. He just wants
the coat is the coat. Ironically, people were critiquing the coat. They're like, that's a really expensive jacket. It's a Burton snowboarding jacket. His son was working for Burton at the time and got him the jacket as a Christmas present. And he wears, as a good Vermonter, he's wearing his Burton snowboarding jacket.
It's, pretty much everybody in New England saw those jokes and were just like, well, yeah, I mean, it gets cold. It gets cold here. So
that was him during he's like, I don't understand why people are making a big deal. It was cold at the inauguration. You wear mittens. That's what you do. It's cold.
The New Englanders thought that was great. You have maybe you have a dress coat that you can wear from the car to the restaurant for fancy occasions, but when you're cold and you're going to be outside, you wear a proper winter jacket. And those mittens, that actually feeds into the question. Those mittens and that meme of him sitting there blew up. It was all anybody saw on social media for 2 or 3 weeks at least, and he leaned into it, and he produced and sold t-shirts and sweatshirts with his picture on it and raised a significant amount of money for charity. And I can think of a lot of politicians that would be like, well, they're making me a meme and that's not respectful. And he just leaned into it and he raised, I wrote it down, $1.8 million for charity, most of which went to Meals on Wheels Vermont. So why does Bernie stay in politics if he doesn't want to play ball with the social part of it?
Because the fight is his life. The fight for the values he believes in has been what he has done for 40 years at this point, since he was elected mayor, and before, he would run and it wasn't the whole of his life. But since he was elected mayor, it has been a part of his life. And he has always been an outsider, even as mayor. The first 2 years, the city council took away his entire budget, wouldn't even let him have a secretary as mayor. And he managed to win over the entire city. And he managed to become an incredibly popular mayor. And by the way, what people don't realize, I think some New Englanders will recognize this, Vermont was a very Republican state. One of my favorite pieces of political trivia, that if you ever want to stump anybody, though this piece of political trivia will not work in shortly, and I'm giving away the answer, is there is one United States senator who is the only Democrat ever elected from their state. And the answer is Pat Leahy. Because Jeffords was a Republican who became an independent. Bernie's an independent. Leahy, there's no Democrat going back to the founding of the Republic elected from Vermont, because Vermont has been a Republican state all along. Leahy and look, when Leahy was elected, it was still a very conservative state. He kind of comes out of that 70s Watergate era. And then Bernie, when Bernie ran for Congress the first time, he was unseating a Republican in a 3-way race. And, he actually thought he would lose his second term because he voted against the first Iraq war, which, by the way, he was right about. But his fight, his perseverance shifted the politics. The politics of Vermont are substantially different today because of Bernie Sanders. And look, and Patrick Leahy too, but with the two of them. So that was a fight of his. When he came to DC, Democrats really didn't know what to do with him. And there was a long time where there was debate about whether they would even allow him in the caucus. This was right after the end of the Cold War, and he's a socialist. Oh my God, we can't have a socialist in the Democratic caucus. And there were fights, and you see like quotes from that period, like somebody like Bill Richardson, who became Clinton's ambassador to the UN, was Secretary of Energy, et cetera, but was a House member at that point. And he's quoted calling Bernie a homeless waif, which, that was his colleagues in the House. And he never felt fully welcomed there. The Senate was a different story. Harry Reid and Chuck Schumer actually recruited Bernie to run for Senate in 2006. When Jeffords said he was retiring, their first phone call was to Bernie and being like, you should run. If you run, you're our candidate. And in the Senate, he's been head of 2 committees, both veterans and budget. He's a member of leadership. It's a different story, but he's still an outsider. And being an outsider in that fight is what he believes in. And he's not somebody who, before I worked for Bernie, I saw Bernie. This weekend is the White House Correspondents' Dinner. I saw Bernie at the White House Correspondents' Dinner. Looking back, I don't think I've ever seen him more uncomfortable than that dinner, where first off, everyone's in tuxedos. I think he was just wearing a suit. He didn't change out of his normal suit. But, it wasn't his scene with all these celebrities asking to take selfies. And it's not that he doesn't appreciate it. It's just not his core element of why he does politics. And look, there are things he enjoys. My one story in the book, which I think was funny, was Bill de Blasio asked Bernie to swear him in and give his address, given a speech at his in his 2018 inauguration, I believe. Yeah, it had to be 2018 inauguration. And so that is New Year's Day in New York City, which, by the way, is another exceptionally cold day. And he's like, he agreed. And I walked in, I was like, that means you have to be in New York City New Year's Eve. He's like, what are you talking about? I was like, the swearing in ceremony's at noon. There are no flights from Vermont that will get you in on time that morning. It's like, okay. So he's thinking about it. And he's like, can we go watch the ball drop? And I was like, it's like this quintessential New York kid who he's like, can they get us in and out? I was like, I think the mayor of New York can arrange for us to go in and out. So my wife, myself, Bernie, and Jane went to dinner at Gracie Mansion with Bill de Blasio. And then we all got in the cars and motorcaded in with a full police escort right into Times Square in the middle of the New Year's Eve. And I think Bill de Blasio gets disappointed because Bernie walks out into that crowd of 500,000 people, or that huge crowd. And everyone's suddenly they see Bernie and the crowd erupts in chanting his name. Mariah Carey's there, but Bernie's the rock star. And he's in the crowd and he just watches it and he's just excited. He was excited for this pageantry and also excited that we were able to enter and exit without, because the other quintessential New York thing is nobody wants to be there on New Year's Eve stuck in that crowd, right? So for me, it was great. I get to see the ball drop and I never have to deal with any of the stuff that people have to deal with to see the ball drop. There were other moments like that. It just, you can see the moments that bring him back to things as a kid. We were in Arizona and we had a morning free, and I have a friend in DC, and her father was was a Dodgers baseball player, and her sister was working for the Dodgers. And I was like, it was during spring training, and I was like, let's take Bernie to Dodgers spring training. That'll be a thing for him. And so we get in the car in the morning and we go to Dodgers spring training, and he's really excited. And we bought him, another staffer had found a Brooklyn Dodgers hat and bought it for him, with the B. And we pull up and he's just so excited to be at spring training. And he's talking with Yasi Pui. He's watching the pitchers. And there's the place where all the fans line up, and Bernie walks out into the fan area, and they go crazy. It's literally our core voters, Latinos from Los Angeles, dominating that fan section, which is Bernie's core Bernie voters. And they're all he's having he does have a great time with that stuff. But to him, it is all about the issues. By the way, he did my favorite moment of that was where they came out and they're like, here's some LA Dodgers hats. And will you put one of those on? He was just nope. Brooklyn Dodgers all the way. not giving that up. Walter O'Malley is he told the Walter O'Malley joke, that the old joke from Brooklyn in the 50s where, they're the three most evil people in the world are Hitler, Stalin, and Walter O'Malley, not necessarily in that order. But you could see it brings him back to his kids. To be honest, the baseball thing is one of his kind of formative ideological moments, because it's where, as a kid, he's a huge Brooklyn Dodger fan. These are his heroes. By the way, at the Dodgers thing, he's like going over the lineups. He's like, he still knows all the players, all that. We're there, and he's talking about how this was a moment where a super rich person took something that he felt belonged to the community. He describes it as like, it would be the same if somebody said Prospect Park was moving to Los Angeles. Like, you couldn't take that out of Brooklyn and move it to Los Angeles, but they took a thing that was at the center of their community, and a rich person for profit stole it from them. And if you look at, like, it's a formulative moment for his ideology, that sense that like a rich person can come into a community and tear its soul out. It's part of why, frankly, in the book I talk about this, he got into such a huge fight with Manfred, the commissioner of baseball, about the minor league baseball, when they started shutting down minor league baseball teams, including a team that Bernie was at the center of kind of founding. It was the Vermont Reds. Then it became the Lake Monsters, the Burlington Lake Monsters eventually. And they basically took it out of the minor leagues. It still exists, but as like a separate, I don't quite understand, but as a separate entity now. But why he fought that so vigorously, because he believed, minor league baseball is a central community activity. It's like, you can go out to the ballpark for $5, get a hot dog, meet the players. Like, that sense of community is a core part of his ideology.
Arguably, there are a few sports that are they're not rich kid sports, so to speak. You require very little equipment to play baseball, to play basketball, to play soccer. And there's a reason why those sports are so popular. It's because they can be community sports. There's no real financial barrier to joining them. And they're wonderful for communities.
And to him, minor league teams represent, you don't have to have a lot of money to take your kids out on a Friday night to a minor league game. You could do it for under $20, and it's like a great fan experience. They're not separated from the players. The kids get to go see the players, and maybe one of those players ends up in the major league.
Yep. And it's accessible to become one of those minor league players as well as a stepping stone. There are many sports that have a significant financial investment just to start practicing. And baseball is not one of them. All right, so The Fighting Soul is available from Gibson's Bookstore. If you have questions, please do put them in the chat sidebar. You mentioned baseball, the Dodgers. In 2016, we had Bernie come to Concord in Gibson's Bookstore. He packed a theater. And one of the questions that the interviewer asked was about starting lineups of the Dodgers. So that's funny. He filled the theater. They all came out to see him. There were a few things that we were a little surprised about. Even though we knew he was tall, we did not expect him to be that tall.
He's very tall and very athletic, and I don't think people realize those two things about him.
He came in and he was like a coiled spring of energy. It was just like, wow, you don't want to be sitting still. This is amazing. Like, he came in and it was just tremendous energy in his still body. He was focused. He was a little bit guarded. This was 2016. And the onstage interviewer was someone he had worked with before. So even though he was focused and a little bit guarded, the interviewer's child was there and they had met before. And as soon as he saw the child, she had a little bag of specific candy that was an inside joke between them. His whole body and face just lit up. And he was just so kind to her. Can you talk a little bit about Bernie and his openness with people who don't seem to want anything from him? Everything he gives is for the people, and he's just so open with children. That's
the trick. He constantly has felt, especially since 2016, that everybody who's talking to him wants something from him.
Yes.
And he especially feels on guard with that in DC. Like, the people he loves in DC, like cab drivers in DC, like, love Bernie. Like, They will stop cabs on the street to be like, hey, Bernie, and he'll go have a conversation because he knows all they want to do is communicate, like they want to have a conversation, and that he's happy to do. What he doesn't like about DC is he feels everybody else wants something from him, that there's an ulterior motive, that there's, they expect something from him. Children, same thing. And he loves children, loves his grandkids, loves, and it's not like he's kissing babies for the camera. In fact, he kind of rejects that also. But like, if there's a child, he like, especially, I've seen this over and over again where, where a staffer's child would be in a room and he would light up with the child, completely. And, it's a real, I think it is because there's an innocence there. There's a sense that they don't want anything. There's a sense that there's no agenda. They're also going to tell him the truth. I mean, and that's the other thing with young people. There were so many times on the campaign. There was once I always like to recall, we were in Iowa before the campaign. We were driving across the state, and we'd actually pulled over to community college to use the bathroom because colleges tend to have open doors where you can walk in and use a bathroom when you're on the road. It's a neat little trick. And there was a high school band competition going on. And the band, one of the bands, he just started chatting. He just gathered them around. Oh, so what's going on? What issues do you care about? Or what are you doing about college? And like, we had a camera crew with us, our own. I had my camera, and he was like, no, don't take pictures, don't video. I don't want it. I just want to have a conversation. He really, and like, he has a real conversation about what they need, what their lives are like, what they care about. And I think part of the reason, frankly, he's so good with the youth vote is that, that he has that energy with people, especially people he doesn't feel wants anything, who just want to chat with him.
He does. It was a genuine connection. She was so excited. She had that little bag of candy and she was practically vibrating with excitement, like, because she knew that he would ask how she was and he'd mean it. And kids can tell when you're like just kind of playing for it and like kind of saying like, and how are you? And he just genuinely, again, he's very tall. She was about 7, and he just kind of like came down to her level.
He's over 6 feet.
Yeah, he just kept going up. But for her, he came down and he was there for her. And it was just a kind moment. It was a kind moment backstage. And I had my camera and I was like, no, this is a genuine moment, because that's what he seems to be about, is genuine connections.
Yes.
So, okay. So new question. You and Senator Sanders share a cultural background. You have a very long resume that got you, of course, the position in which you were working with him. As mentioned, you were the deputy campaign manager on his 2020 presidential campaign, and you've been his aide for years. But you do also share a cultural background. Did that make it easy to mesh and to work together?
I think it allowed me, there's some level of, I think, communications kismet and natural thing. I don't know if there was, I don't think it was ever acknowledged. I mean, my grandfather's name was Bernie. He was from the Bronx, though, not from Brooklyn. So slight, Yankees fans, not Dodger fans. So there might be some division there. But, I think that shared background does help form somewhat of a connection, though. I think, he would say people around me are around me for confidence. He's kind of unsentimental about that stuff. It's interesting. I think what he likes is people around him are very much there for the cause and not for him. And there are a few people who are there genuinely just because of him. And I'm not saying we're not there for him, but I'm saying what brings most staff to him is he represents a certain type of politics that you don't get anywhere else. And because frankly, like working for Bernie is not a career boon. Working for Bernie is not the best way to rise up in Democratic politics. Working for Bernie is not a resume booster, but that's not why you work for him. You work for him because you want to work for somebody who will change the system. And he likes that, like I would say, like take someone like Jeff Weaver. Jeff is really someone who is there 100% for Bernie. Because, he spent literally his entire adult life, 35 years now, working with Bernie. And it's not to say people aren't loyal, but people come to him for the cause. Right. And he likes that. He likes that he has unsentimental warriors fighting for him.
I was going to ask if there was an aspect, even though you had very different jobs, you were the campaign manager, he was the politician, was there an aspect of mentorship in your relationship? But that was not what you were there for. That was not what he was there for.
And I've had bosses where there is an aspect of mentorship. And it was a different, being deputy campaign manager, working in the office as deputy chief of staff, as legislative director, I was around him for 4 straight years, but like I've had bosses who have been very much in the mentorship vein. Harry Reid, much more in kind of a mentorship vein than very different politician, much more in a mentorship vein than Bernie. But you don't come to Bernie for mentorship. You come to Bernie to fight on issues.
Okay. So next questions, they tie together. How long do you think Bernie might stay in politics? And also, what's next for him? What's next for you?
I mean, look, I think he relishes his role in the Senate. I think he likes his present role in the Budget Committee. Just looking at some of the shuffling that could take, I'm getting ahead of him. So I'm saying something that is not just based on like knowing the Senate. This isn't based on any inside information, but looking at the Senate, if Pat Leahy's retiring, which likely means Patty Murray's moving to appropriations, which opens up the Help Committee, and Bernie's kind of next in seniority there. So you could see him take over a committee where it's literally a committee of the issues Bernie cares about. It's minimum wage. Well, Medicare for All is not in the Health Committee. That's actually, interestingly, in the Finance Committee. I know Senate's a weird place, but Medicare is considered under Finance. But a lot of the prescription drug stuff he cares about is in the Senate. The College for All stuff, in the Help Committee. The College for All stuff is in the Help Committee. So much of his agenda is there. So I could see him, who knows what will happen with that? That's not, there's no announcements on that. There's no anything, but you can see how the Senate works. He's certainly in position to be a very prominent voice on that committee in the next Senate. And I could see him relishing that. I think he's somebody who, I don't know, I can't see him retiring from public office ever. I can't see him like going back to Vermont and sitting on Lake Champlain. I mean, he enjoys that, but I can't see that ever being his full-time thing. And look, he's somebody with an inhuman amount of energy. Like this week, just take this week, he was in Vermont, then he flew to New York City and went to Staten Island, which, it's not like you get, like Staten Island's like not near the airport really, like you got to get there. He went to Staten Island to the Amazon warehouse, worked, rallied with the workers at the Amazon warehouse, then got on an airplane, flew to Richmond and met with Starbucks workers on the same day, on Sunday. He doesn't need to do that. He could have done that 2 weeks but he's like, gotta work, busy, I'm sure. And did those 2 things. Yesterday at 8 a.m, he was protesting outside the White House for the president to cancel some student debt. And like that, and at the same time, he's in the Senate, working not only on national issues, but like, he very much cares about like earmarks in Vermont, which are now back, and how can he help the state and working on those issues. So I just never see him slowing down.
I have a few people in my life that I refer to as working breed dogs. If you don't give them a job to do, they fall apart. They're miserable. You can't tell them to relax. It's not going to happen. They
Yeah, it's just not.
always need a project. They need to overschedule themselves.
Well, he doesn't, he's very cautious about actually not overscheduling so he can work on stuff. I think that's part of his talent. He actually is he's very good at understanding like where the limit is on overscheduling.
That's effective. That makes him a more effective at doing his job. All right. So we have a question here from the audience. What are your thoughts on term limits?
I hate term limits, to be honest. Just as a personal view, I don't like them, and a few reasons. First, in terms of let's talk in terms of Congress specifically. Here's why I don't like term limits. Number one, I do think, look, I think there is an argument we have to give voters a choice here, but here will be the result of term limits. You know, let's take what I said about earmarks. Everybody hated earmarks a few years ago. And you know, they went away and they banned earmarks. And the result wasn't less corruption, which was the point. The result was instead of local leaders being able to say, I think this project in my community is good, I think this project in my community is good, you had bureaucrats outside of, with no responsibility to local communities making those decisions. That wasn't good. You also untethered every congressman from the appropriations process, which has led to, frankly, a more difficult one and a more partisan one, and one where members don't feel like, look, if it's one thing to vote against an appropriations bill when it's just some big bill from the other party and you can just grandstand against it. It's another thing when it means, you know, voting against it means you're voting against $1 million for the school in your district. You're voting against the road construction that your district needs. And I think you've seen, that's why you've seen the backtrack to adding earmarks in. With term limits in Congress, what is the unintended consequence of that? The unintended consequence will be a mass increase in corruption. And why I say that is, one of the things that Newt Gingrich did in 1994 when he took over Congress was start to reduce the amount of staffs on committees and member offices. What did that do? Well, it took a lot of senior staff and sent them to K Street. And what did Congress do? Instead of having the expertise over decades in office, people who worked on like health issues in Congress, feeling that that was their job for decades, a lot of those people fled to corporate interests on K Street because that's where the job, because you took away their jobs, that's where the jobs were for people with their set of expertise. Same thing with term limits. You have the best members of Congress are the ones who, look, there are terrible members of Congress and there needs to be more ways to vote them out. I think there needs to, like, frankly, I think all around our system would be better with, instead of term limits, less partisan drawn districts and more very competitive districts where members are forced to run every cycle really hard. In districts that aren't competitive, like real primaries, if for not an ideological reason, but so members are on their toes with their constituents, right? That's the mechanism to vote people out. Term limits, what it does is, so what that will mean is, just like the staffer who spent 20 years on the Energy and Commerce Committee dealing with energy policy is now working for the oil company or the gas company, members build up expertise on issues. And instead of members who don't want to go to K Street, who want to spend their time, who really develop expertise, which actually is important for legislating, you would get a situation where, okay, I can be in Congress for 8 years, which is frankly a very short amount of time. Like, the first 2 years any member spends, in the first 4 years, they're really still learning the rules. In the Senate, really, it takes probably 6 to 10 years to just know how the chamber works in a lot of ways. So you take all that expertise and now you have everybody there being an amateur with no senior guidance from anybody. And so where is the senior guidance? Where are they going to get advice from? Well, the old members. And the members who now can't be members of Congress, what are they going to do? They're going to go to K Street. They're going to lobby, or they're going to take jobs. The real scam in DC are the people who aren't lobbyists, right? Who never register as a lobbyist, but are consultants who don't lobby. They never lobby, but if their friend on the Hill needs some advice, they can pick up the phone and call them. But they're working for every corporate interest in the world. I see somebody's asking, what is K Street? K Street is the street in DC where a bunch of the corporate lobbying firms are based. They're all over, but K Street is kind of shorthand for corporate lobbyists in DC. A lot of their offices are on K Street in Washington.
Something I'd never considered, that we would hemorrhage institutional knowledge.
Yeah, and I understand the desire for term limits, but the question for me isn't, are people term limited? Because I think having a member in Congress for, let's say, 5 terms, 10 years, but them never having a tough re-election battle is just as bad as having somebody in Congress for 20 years. Like what I would rather do is structure or elect. If I was thinking about big structural changes with term limits, which term limits would be, I would think about really making sure, look, that the ideal should be districts that challenge people every cycle, where every member is worried about their reelection and worried about their constituents. Because the issue is, first off, you have people in easy districts raising tons of money, right? So it's not like the money corruption goes away just because they're in a safe district. In fact, the truth is the most corrupt members of Congress are all in the safest districts in terms of campaign finance stuff. Overall, you go down the list, you look at people that you just think are corrupt, every single one of them is in a safe district. You know why? Because they can be corrupt because they know they're not responsive to their constituents. And part of that is they're in a completely safe district and nobody's ever going to challenge them.
That's a pretty great explanation. All right. Michael asks, if Bernie runs again in 2024, will you be the campaign manager with him?
Absolutely not. I'm going to be honest. I left the office in July because I do not have the energy to keep up with him. I cannot see myself doing a presidential campaign. I will vote for Bernie. I will be a vocal supporter. I will certainly help the campaign, but I cannot see working in any capacity like I worked in 2020. Ever again for any politician. There's a play. I think we go through cycles in politics, and I think it's unhealthy in a way for the same people to come back again and again and again. And I think if he did run again, it would be good for him to have new blood at the top, new ideas, a new way to run the campaign. That's not a shot at anybody. I just think, but for myself personally, I honestly just don't have it in me.
It's a pretty good reason not to do it.
And by the way, he deserves people who have it fully in them. Now look, I'm going to be honest, he made that comment about 2024, but said there was the memo, but if Joe Biden doesn't run again, I don't know the word. I don't, unless there's like a medical reason Joe Biden doesn't run again, I really don't see him not running. All indications are that. But I will say, do I think Bernie could run? Yes. Do I think it's likely? No, only because I think Joe Biden's likely to run again. And he already said he wouldn't run against Joe Biden.
Well, the commenter says, thanks for the explanation. You did an amazing job. So you can end that bit on a high note. So this has been one of their favorite events. We're getting some pretty great comments. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. To our audience members, Ari Rabin Havt's new book, The Fighting Soul: On the Road with Bernie Sanders, is available from Gibson's Bookstore. Ari, thank you for joining us this evening.
Thank you for having me. And, if you buy the book, buy it from Gibson's, or, not to get Gibson competitors, but other local shops.
Other locals are on the same side as we are, so support your local indie. Also, this Saturday is Indie Bookstore Day.
So go out, buy some books at an indie bookstore. Bookshop. It is really, I was in DC today. I had to walk to an interview, and I walked by 3 bookstores, 3 places in DC that were bookstores that had closed. And that's a really sad thing to think about, and closed years ago, like in the before the pandemic, but still 3 major bookshops that were kind of institutions in DC that had closed. And without these institutions, they're community centers, they're places for events. And there are things that certain rivers in South America can't replace.
It's true. It's true. It's very, very true. Thank you very much for joining us. I know you said that we are not even your last interview of the day. You have at least one more to do today. So on that note, we will say goodnight to you. Congratulations on your new book. And thank you to our audience members for joining us tonight.
Thank you, everyone.
Have a good night, everybody.